Hello, this is Mrs. Grosch, and the topic for today's lecture is climate. There's an old saying that helps us to understand the difference between climate and weather. The expression is, climate is what you expect, but weather is what you get. And what that means is if you walk out of your house in, I don't know, let's say December or January, and it's really warm out, you might think to yourself, oh my gosh, the climate must be changing. It's a lot warmer than it's supposed to be in the winter. Well, the climate may or may not be changing, but you really can't make that judgment based on a single day's weather. In fact, we define climate as weather over a long period of time. The official definition for climate is that it's the average weather for a particular location over a period of 30 or more years. So when you walk outside and it's warmer than you expect in the winter, well, that's because over a long period of time in Virginia, it's usually pretty cold in January and February. Of course, what we expect in January or February might be different in different parts of the world. So there must be some factors about where you're located that influence your climate. There are really 5 factors that you should know about. The first one is latitude. Latitude is how far north or south of the equator you are. The poles, which would be the farthest north or the farthest south of the equator, have more extreme weather changes, and they tend to be much colder than the equator. Well, the reason why is really about sunlight. The sun, remember, is how we get most of the energy on Earth and most of the energy that is in Earth's atmosphere, which is what affects weather and climate. If you're at the equator, the sunlight that you get tends to be much more direct, and that makes it more concentrated. On the other hand, if you're at the poles, the sunlight is more spread out, and that makes it a lot less intense and less able to warm up the atmosphere. This makes a big difference in climate. So areas that are near the equator tend to be warmer, and areas that are near the poles tend to be colder. Another thing that has a big impact on climate are the oceans. Now, the ocean really affects climate in 2 ways. Ocean water holds heat and releases it very slowly. It also is much harder to warm up water than it is to warm up land. What this means is if you live near the ocean, you're going to tend to have less change in your temperature. If you live in the same latitude, so the same amount north or south of the equator, and you're near the ocean, you will have less extreme temperature changes than if you live at the same latitude, but more inland, away from the ocean water. Another way that oceans affect climate is when the ocean water moves. You remember when we studied surface currents. There are some surface currents that move warm water from the equator to more northern or southern latitudes. For example, the Gulf Stream keeps northern Europe much warmer than it would be otherwise because it takes nice warm water from the Gulf of Mexico and moves it up to a pretty high northern latitude. So ocean currents also have a big impact on climate. Just like there are those patterns of movement in the ocean, there are similar patterns in the atmosphere. Wind patterns. We call them prevailing winds, and they're very predictable. They're mostly because of the way the Earth rotates. Those predictable wind patterns can help to move air masses, which may be warmer or colder depending on where they start. They move them in a particular way across the land, and this also has an impact on climate. One final factor that can affect climate is topography. That's whether you're down low, have a low elevation, or if you're up in the mountains. Mountains not only affect your climate if you are up high, because generally higher elevations have lower temperatures and more wind, but also mountains can really break up weather patterns. You might have a storm cloud that's full of precipitation, full of rain, that gets stuck on one side of a mountain range and never gets across to the other side. So you could actually have a situation where one side of a mountain range is very humid and wet, and the other side is very dry, almost a desert. And that's because the mountain range actually has stopped those air masses from moving from one place to the other. One topic related to climate that has really gotten a lot of attention in recent years is about climate change. So one question that we will be trying to answer is, has Earth's climate stayed the same throughout all of Earth's history, or does it change over time? And you have to remember that the Earth is really old. It's been around for 4.6 billion years. And during that time, there have been a lot of changes that we can figure out using some historical data that's captured in ice and through fossils of plants. We can look at what may have happened in the past and how climate has changed over time. Scientists can look at data that they've collected in those ways and find that over long periods of time, climate has fluctuated from what we call glacial periods, which is where it's extremely cold, the Earth is covered with ice. Sometimes we call these ice ages, and so we have these very cold periods, but then we also have warmer time periods, which are called interglacial periods. And when we're in those time periods, the ice starts to melt, sea levels rise, temperature goes up. And that has happened over and over again over millions and millions of years. What some scientists are concerned about, though, is that it seems that these changes are happening much more rapidly now than they had in the past. As we see these big increases in temperature in recent years, and also notice things like bigger storms and really unusual weather patterns, people start to wonder, is this something that humans are causing, or are these things that happen naturally through things that we can't control? And no one really knows the answer to this question, but there are some ideas that people have that we can examine. Here's some examples of some ideas people have. I can't tell you if these ideas are correct or not. I'm just going to let you know what some people are thinking. Some people say that the Earth's orbit around the sun might change shape over time, and that maybe there are times when we are a little closer to the sun than usual, and this could change our climate. And other people have a similar idea about the Earth's axis. The axis is tilted, and that's one of the reasons that we have seasons. What if that axis tilt changes a little bit at a time? That could impact climate, couldn't it? Some people notice that the sun has times when it seems more active. It produces a lot of what we call sunspots, and other years where it doesn't produce so many. Could this have an impact on our climate? It's hard to say. And finally, let's not forget about the atmosphere. Do you remember the greenhouse effect? It's what keeps us from freezing to death. We need those greenhouse gases to hold in heat. But what if the chemistry of the atmosphere is changing, either from natural causes like volcanoes, or from more human-made causes like air pollution? If we put more of those gases that hold in heat into the atmosphere, wouldn't that change the climate? As you can see, climate is complicated, and we're really just going to brush the surface. But hopefully by the time we're finished with this unit, you'll have a better understanding of climate and what people are talking about when they talk about climate change. I know this has been a long lecture, but I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow.